Today we're going to talk about the Council of Nikaea. The high point of the Great Crusade is largely considered to be the Ullanor Crusade, which was a series of assaults against the largest orc empire that had ever been seen at the time. To give you an idea of how big this assault was, Jagatai Khan, Horus, and Raboot Guilliman, their whole legions, and elements of other legions all fought in the Ullanor Crusade. After the Ullanor Crusade, the Emperor announced that he would be going back to Terra to work on a special project that would benefit all of humanity, and he named Horus War Master. Which means not only will he not be participating in the Great Crusade anymore, he won't even really be leading them because Horus will be giving the commands in his stead. But before he went back to Terra, he called a council on the world of Nikaea because there was a bit of unrest about the use of psychics in the Space Marine legions. Leman Russ really did not like psychic abilities, and after fighting alongside the Thousand Sons, he liked them even less. Leman Russ did not have psychers like librarians in his legion, and he wanted other legions to do the same. But once he saw a member of the Thousand Sons Legion begin to experience the flesh change, he began to push even harder for this. So essentially, the Council of Nikaea was a debate about whether or not psychers should still continue to be used in the Imperium of Man. Those against the use of psychic abilities in the Imperium gave warnings about the dangers of sorcery. And you should know that sorcery is considered slightly different than normal psychic abilities because it requires making deals with some kind of psychic entity for knowledge or power that you wouldn't otherwise be able to have. The Emperor was on the fence about whether psychic abilities should be used in the Imperium, but he was absolutely opposed to sorcery, because he was one of the few people that understood the dangerous kinds of beings and gods that lived in the warp. The other side of the debate was led by Magnus, whose position was that they should not only continue to use psychic abilities in the Imperium, but they should actually dig deeper and learn more about them. But the Council of Nikaea wasn't just about whether psychic abilities should be used, it was also a trial for Magnus. And as evidence of his use of sorcery became more clear, the Emperor got very angry. Magnus was the only other person that the Emperor trusted with knowledge about the chaos in the warp, and he had betrayed that trust. So the Emperor declared that the only psychers allowed in the Imperium would be navigators and astropaths because they were absolutely necessary for faster-than-light travel. Every legion had to close their librarius, and none of them were to ever use their psychic powers ever again. The Emperor also decreed that every legion was to start using chaplains, which at the time were only in use by the word-bearers. And their job was to ensure that every legion followed the ideals of the Imperial truth and did not use psychic abilities. Let's talk about the Chaos God Nurgle. Nurgle, also known as the Plague Lord, is the Chaos God of pestilence, despair, decay, and rebirth. And even though it gains strength from the despair of mortals, it's actually relatively nice for a Chaos God. The bar is very, very low, though. Nurgle and its demons are relatively friendly and nice because they see spreading their diseases as a kindness. And as much as he represents decay and disease, he also represents the possibility for new life because a lot of that decay and disease does come from living beings like bacteria usually. Because of the attitude that they have, the demons of Nurgle tend to treat him like a father figure, sometimes calling him things like Grandfather Nurgle, Father Nurgle, stuff like that. Nurgle usually blesses his followers with things like extra endurance, resilience, and the inability to feel things because they're often afflicted with all kinds of diseases. And sometimes the diseases that they'd be inflicted with would be brand new things that no one had ever seen before. In fact, that's kind of why Nurgle is often depicted with a cauldron. He's always experimenting with new ailments. And Nurgle is able to come up with some pretty nasty stuff because he was actually able to imprison a god. If you didn't know, the Warhammer 40k universe was created by taking a fantasy version of Warhammer that already existed and then putting it into a sci-fi setting. So there is an alien race based off the elves called the Eldari, and they had their own Eldari pantheon of gods. So the Plague Lord imprisoned the Eldari goddess of life and healing deep inside his realm in the warp. She'll heal from any kind of ailment that Nurgle inflicts on her so he can study the effects, and then she'll just go back to the way she was. But Isha cleverly fights back by secretly whispering the cures to a lot of those diseases to mortals. Today we're going to talk about the Chaos God Khorne. Khorne, also known as the Lord of Rage, is the god of war, anger, strength, and ending lives, and he's the oldest of the Chaos Gods. Anytime a mortal takes the life of another mortal, Khorne is given power, whether that person intended to give Khorne power or not. The more senseless and destructive the act is, the more power he gets. A follower of Khorne is as likely to be a valiant warrior as they are a crazed berserker, but they all see an impossible challenge as the ultimate thing to overcome, and they all want to mercilessly destroy their enemies. Khorne does have his own sense of honor, though, and he respects others that fight fairly and with their own sense of honor, and he sees those that are weak and helpless as beneath him and unworthy of his wrath. Of all the Chaos Gods, Khorne has the most raw power, and a large part of that is because of just how easy it is to empower him. His followers don't have to waste time building temples or worshipping him, because all of that would just be a waste of time that they could have spent fighting. In fact, if a follower of Khorne doesn't participate in some kind of combat for too long, then they risk making their god angry. It's so easy to empower Khorne that even the Space Marines are empowering him as they fight their Great Crusade, which is likely something that the Emperor is all too aware of. The Lord of Rage considers sorcery or any kind of psychic abilities to be trickery and cowardly, so he does not like psykers. And as you might expect, he also hates the Chaos God of Sorcery, Tzeentch. And it's important to note that followers of Khorne are trying to end as many lives as quickly as they can, and not to inflict suffering on those people. This isn't a kindness though, of course, it's because if they were to wound their enemy rather than taking them out completely, then the intense sensations that they're feeling would actually feed Khorne's rival, Slaanesh. Today we're talking about the Chaos God Slaanesh. Slaanesh, also known as the Prince of Desire or She Who Thirsts, is the god of hedonism, obsession, and desire. Followers of Slaanesh typically desire perfection or to experience sensations as intensely as possible, whether that's through clothing, or artwork, or food. The Prince of Desire is fed by emotions like lust and ambition, and as you might expect, they'll appear in whatever form allows them to manipulate whoever they're after the most. Slaanesh's rival is Nurgle because they represent opposing emotions and ideals. For instance, Nurgle would typically bless one of his followers with the inability to feel pain from whatever ailment he's inflicted upon them, which is in direct opposition to the way that followers of Slaanesh would want to push that sensation to its absolute limit. Slaanesh is also the youngest of the Chaos Gods, and her birth had a huge effect on both the warp and real space. As you might remember from my video on Nurgle, the Eldari are a race of aliens that are based off of elves, and they're incredibly powerful psykers. They experience their emotions very intensely, which means that they give off a lot of psychic energy into the warp. The Eldari are very long-lived and became bored with regular life, so they began pushing their sensations as far as they could. They performed all kinds of hedonistic and sadistic acts throughout their empire that eventually caused such a concentration of psychic energy that, well, a giant warp rift opened. This is the Eye of Terror. It is a giant warp rift 20,000 light years across, and it opened when Slaanesh was born. It consumed every single one of the worlds in the Eldari Empire at the time, also known as the Crone Worlds, and almost every single Eldari. In fact, the term She Who Thirsts is used by the Eldari specifically because of the fact that Slaanesh really hungers for Eldari souls specifically. Some Eldari were scared that something like this might happen if their empire continued on its way, and they were able to survive by creating massive arcs. And from that point on, every Eldari had to take some kind of measure to make sure that their soul was contained when they died, or Slaanesh would immediately consume it when it entered the warp. Now let's talk about the Chaos God Tzeentch. Tzeentch, also known as the Lord of Change, is a god of change, sorcery, intrigue, trickery, and knowledge. And he's also the second oldest of the Chaos Gods. The warp is a realm made of psychic energy, and since in Warhammer 40k they took fantasy themes and put them into a sci-fi setting, psychic abilities are basically treated like magic abilities. In other words, Tzeentch is a god of sorcery in a realm made of magic energy, so he's a force to be reckoned with for sure. Tzeentch feeds off of mortals' hope or desire that things will change for the better. Whether that means better for them or better for others is another matter though. The Chaos Gods generally don't love each other, but Tzeentch is constantly scheming to try to become the dominant power in the warp. But the irony is, even if Tzeentch achieved this goal and was actually the dominant power in the warp, it would still want that to change because it's its nature. The thing that makes Tzeentch kind of complicated is the fact that its nature is simply to change, and that it just always wants things to change. Tzeentch makes all these schemes and plots just because it likes doing it, and some of those plots are so complex that they affect the lives of innumerable beings throughout the galaxy. The Lord of Change can see the whole present and the whole past, and it has a mind powerful enough to try to predict where its schemes are going to go in the future, but it can't actually see the future. So Tzeentch tried to get around this by using something called the Well of Eternity. The Well of Eternity is a spot on the warp that is considered the center of reality, and it's apparently where space and time both began and where it will end. And you know that it's a big deal because Tzeentch actually wouldn't even go into the well himself. He sent in some of his greater demons called Lords of Change. Only one of these Lords of Change actually returned, but it was much older and it now had 2 heads. The demon is known as Kairos Fate Weaver, and one head sees the past while the other head sees the future. It cannot, however, see the present. And it does that thing where when one head tells the truth, The other head says something contradictory but equally believable. You know, that old chestnut. Let's talk about Chaos Undivided and the Great Game. The four Chaos Gods are constantly fighting each other for a couple reasons. The first reason being that they kind of hate each other. There are rivalries between Khorne and Slaanesh and Nurgle and Tzeentch because they both represent sets of opposing forces. Tzeentch and Nurgle both represent change in a way, but Tzeentch feeds off of people's dreams and hopes, while Nurgle preys off of people's despair. Khorne and Slaanesh hate each other because Khorne is all about getting it done and then moving on, and Slaanesh is all about staying in the moment for as long as you can and pushing things to their extreme. Also, Khorne has a sense of martial honor and duty, which are essentially like a set of rules you give yourself, and Slaanesh is all about breaking every rule that you can to try to get to that next feeling. This constant struggle for dominance between those four gods is called the Great Game, and it's generally the thing that the Chaos Gods are most interested in. The mortal world and the mortals that live in it are generally not important to the Chaos Gods at all, but there are exceptions to this. On the rare occasion where the Chaos Gods think that there's something in the mortal world that could either really hurt them or really help all of them, they actually team up, and they are known as Chaos Undivided at that point. And just so you're aware, this 8-pointed star is the symbol of Chaos Undivided. There are also people that worship Chaos Undivided even when the four gods aren't teamed up, because they see either all four gods as equal or as part of one thing that is chaos. When the Chaos Gods do team up, even though it is a huge problem, it doesn't last long because as soon as they're done, they go back to fighting. Sometimes they even go back to fighting before they're done completing their goal. Now we're going to talk about the Pilgrimage of Lorgar. When we last talked about the Word-Bearers, one of their most holy cities had just been destroyed by the Ultramarines after the Emperor found out that they had been spreading a religion declaring him a God Emperor. The Emperor humiliated them, called them failures, and made it very clear that he was not a god. For a time, the Word-Bearers kind of withdrew and didn't really play a part in the Great Crusade while Lorgar was experiencing his crisis of faith. He had grown up deeply religious and always believed that the Emperor was his god, and now he didn't have a god, and he was sort of desperate for one, or some gods, to believe in. Seeing this opportunity, Lorgar's two most trusted advisors, his foster father Prospero and his first chaplain Erebus, provide him with those gods. The three of them were from the same home planet where there had been a religion that worshipped four deities that were secretly the Chaos Gods. And Lorgar had also noticed that while they were conquering planets throughout the galaxy, there were a lot of them that were following religions that also followed four benevolent gods that resembled those four gods from his home planet as well. And that's because the four Chaos Gods had a way of sort of subconsciously affecting people's minds and putting more benevolent versions of themselves in there. Over some time, though, the Chaos Gods had revealed their true nature to Prospero and Erebus, and they had been corrupted, and now they were going to corrupt Lorgar. So, after they advised him, he decided to go on a pilgrimage to find gods that would be worthy of his worship. Eventually, they reached a planet called Nikaea that was so close to the Eye of Terror that the people that lived there had eyes that were purple, the same color as the Eye of Terror. They were confronted by a Chaos Priestess who knew they were coming, and who told them that yes, the similarities between all these gods they had seen throughout the galaxy were in fact because they were the four Chaos Gods. The Priestess was extremely misleading about the actual nature of the Chaos Gods, though, implying that they were much nicer than they actually were. The Priestess entered the Eye of Terror with Lorgar and then became a demon, who began to feed him a series of half-truths and lies that would eventually get him to turn to chaos. For instance, she brought Lorgar to this Eldari crone world and told him that Slaanesh was a god of joy that had been born from the Eldari, but after they abandoned her, in her grief, she screamed and opened the Eye of Terror. The demon told Lorgar that beings in the warp without souls were just as alive as beings with souls in real space, and that Chaos's ultimate goal was to form a kind of union between those two things, and that the rejection of this union was why the Eldari fell. She also showed Lorgar this, an avatar of one of the Eldari gods, telling him that even a divine being could be killed. And she also told Lorgar that all of his brothers had been complete and had known their full powers all along, but that he hadn't, and then his psychic powers began to grow a lot from that point on. Finally, the demon began to show Lorgar a series of visions, like the Word-Bearers attacking the Emperor's palace on Terra. And then she showed Lorgar Magnus's homeworld, and you should know Lorgar and Magnus were always very close. Lorgar saw Magnus's homeworld of Prospero being destroyed, and the demon explained to him that it was because the Emperor and his Primarchs had betrayed Magnus. From that point on, Lorgar became convinced that the Chaos Gods were true gods worthy of his worship, and he's followed them ever since. Let's talk about the Emperor's secret project, also known as the Imperial Webway project. The Webway, also known as the Labyrinth Dimension, is typically what the Eldari will use to travel faster than light instead of using the warp. The Webway is kind of like its own dimension that sits between the warp and real space, so you can travel through it pretty safely. It's made up of a series of tunnels that were built using some kind of physical material with psychic properties. And that essentially seals it off from the warp and prevents anything like a demon from getting in. Which also means, generally speaking, the only way to get into the Webway is through a Webway gate. The Eldari didn't actually make the Webway or the Webway gates though, and if they ever knew how to build them, that knowledge was probably lost when Slaanesh ate all their Crone worlds. The Eldari are a very, very old race that were originally created to be psychic soldiers in a war for this even older species, called the Old Ones. The Old Ones were insanely advanced in terms of what they could do psychically and technically, and they were very, very smart. There's also reason to believe that they are at least partially responsible for the evolution of several intelligent species, possibly including humans. And they made the orcs. Sort of. They made Krorks that became orcs, but we'll talk about them later. Now, all the way back, or I guess forward, to the Unification Wars, where the Emperor is still fighting to unite all of Terra, he finds a Webway gate and builds the Imperial Palace on top of it. He goes on his Great Crusade, he finds all of his Primarchs, and then at the high point of the Crusade, the Triumph of Ulanor, he announces to all of his sons that he is going back to Terra. The Emperor didn't tell them why he was leaving or what he was working on though, so this announcement created a lot of mixed feelings among the Primarchs. But back on Terra, the Emperor has his absolute best minds working on the Webway project. He creates a special group of engineers just for this project and has them modify the Golden Throne to work as a sort of psychic control. Because the Emperor understood that if humanity was really going to thrive in the future, they were going to have to lose their dependence on the warp. And to that end, the Emperor also had some of those engineers working on creating a tunnel that would be able to connect their Webway gate to the rest of the network. But since the Old Ones' technology was just so far beyond where humanity has ever been, they weren't able to figure out how to make a material that had an innate psychic defense against stuff from the warp. So the idea is that a relatively strong psyker sits in the Golden Throne and generates that psychic defense themselves. Let's talk about the Warrior Lodges and the corruption of Horus. Earlier in the Great Crusade, when the Word-Bearers were still called the Imperial Heralds, they had conquered a planet called Davin with the Luna Wolves. The people that lived there are human, they just either became mutants or abhumans after adapting to their environment. The Imperium usually does not like anything that isn't human. That even includes abhumans and mutants. But if you're useful, then a mutant or an abhuman can have a place in the Imperium. Although in this case, it wasn't as much about how useful they were as much as it was just the Astartes really liked them and respected them after conquering them. They respected their courage and their ability to adapt to any situation, but they also respected some cultural aspects of their planet, namely the Warrior Lodges. Warrior Lodges were kind of like secret societies where soldiers of any rank could come together and speak as equals. The Luna Wolves and the Imperial Heralds were both really interested in the Warrior Lodges, and so they actually ended up adopting those practices into their own legions. The idea was that a Warrior Lodge would promote brotherhood between the Space Marines because it was a place that any of them could come together and speak as equals. Warrior Lodges were pretty secretive though. You generally didn't know what happened inside the lodges, and they'd have all kinds of practices that people that weren't members wouldn't know about. And one of the reasons they had to use a measure of secrecy was because the Emperor was pretty staunchly opposed to these kinds of secret organizations within the legions. And he had a pretty good reason for this too. Okay, now we're going to fast forward. The Imperial Heralds are the word bearers again, and Lorgar has gone on his pilgrimage. Over this period of time, several other legions also copied the practice of warrior lodges from the Luna Wolves. You should also know that during this time, after the triumph of Ulanor, when Horus is declared War Master, the Emperor says that he should name his legion the Sons of Horus. The Emperor wanted to show that Horus was above the other Primarchs, but Horus was against that idea and declined. But after a handful of years, Sanguinius convinced Horus that he deserved the honor of renaming his legion after himself, and he did it. Lorgar's two main advisors, Corpheron and Erebus, had been followers of Chaos for some time already. Since the warrior lodges go against the Emperor's ideals, the Space Marines that are more aligned with his ideals, who are usually the ones born on Terra, also don't like the warrior lodges and usually don't join them. So it becomes a perfect place for Space Marines who haven't been born on Terra and never met the Emperor to be corrupted by Chaos and turn against the Emperor. So in other words, within several legions there are now secret sub-factions of Chaos worshippers. Erebus and Lorgar come up with a plan that involves this sword that has been blessed by Nurgle. The Word-Bearers then returned to Davin, which the Word-Bearers had also converted to become Chaos Worshippers, and they gave them that sword. Then the Word-Bearers asked the Sons of Horus to come help them with this corrupted planet. During the fighting, Horus was wounded with this blade, as was planned, and his wounds just would not heal. The wound wouldn't heal because of whatever Nurgle had done to the blade, and it seemed like that would be the end of Horus. So Erebus convinced some of the Sons of Horus to bring their Primarch to a sort of healer that was on Davin, which, unknown to them, was actually a chaos cult that was going to perform all kinds of weird sorceries on Horus's body. The rituals they performed moved his spirit out of his body into the warp, and he talked to the chaos gods. He saw the future of the Imperium as a violent, repressive theocracy where the Emperor and some of the Primarchs, but not him, were being worshipped as deities. Ironically, that happens because of him, but the Chaos Gods convince him that that's probably what's going to happen if he keeps doing what the Emperor says. They portrayed themselves as victims of the Emperor's psychic power and told Horus that if they could take out the Emperor for him, they would give him the galaxy. So he accepted their offer, and they healed his wounds, and Horus was reborn. Let's talk about the fall of Prospero and Magnus's folly. After the Council of Nikaea, when the Emperor banned the use of pretty much any kind of psychic power, Magnus returned to his homeworld, Prospero. And he did exactly what the Emperor wanted. Nah, he was totally still using psychic powers and looking into sorcery and all kinds of stuff, because he happened to see a horrific vision of the future. He saw Horus and half of the Space Marine legions becoming corrupted by chaos, turning traitor, and then tearing the Imperium apart. First, Magnus tried to telepathically reach out to his brother, but by the time he reached him, he was already corrupted by chaos. Then, Magnus decided he had to warn the Emperor about this, but the legal means of telepathic communication are really slow and kind of unreliable. So Magnus used sorcery to send an astral projection of his own soul to the Emperor's palace because it would be way faster. And in case you forgot, sorcery is a special category of psychic abilities that are even more illegal than regular psychic abilities because they're stronger, but they require making deals with things in the warp, like demons or chaos gods. While Magnus's soul is hurtling through the warp to the Emperor's palace, he sees a Webway corridor that actually leads right to the palace, and he decides to take it as a shortcut. He's unable to break through the psychic barriers and wards that are keeping things from the warp out of the Webway, but then he hears a voice in his head offering to give him enough power to punch through, and he just takes it. And this breach that Magnus made in the defenses of the Webway to try to reach the Emperor is what's known as Magnus's Folly. Now there were a bunch of demons pouring into the Webway, taking out as many of these specialized engineers and custodians as they possibly could. The Emperor does not believe Magnus at all when he tells him that Horus and the other legions will betray him, and after all, Magnus did just use sorcery and essentially destroy the Imperial Webway project maybe forever. The Emperor now believed that Magnus was the traitor and sent Leman Russ and his Space Wolves to Prospero to take Magnus in and explain himself. But on the way there, Horus convinces Leman Russ that the Emperor changed his mind and actually wants them to destroy Prospero instead. And Horus was the War Master, so he had the authority of the Emperor, and Leman believed him. Once Magnus realized that he was being used as a pawn and that they were all being manipulated to essentially have the Thousand Sons and Space Wolves take each other out, he decided not to take part in it. Magnus is a loyalist right now. He believes in the Emperor, and he doesn't want his Space Marines to have to take out other Space Marines that also believe in the Emperor. So he doesn't even warn them that the Space Wolves are coming. In fact, he puts a psychic veil over the planet so that they don't even see it coming. But as Magnus saw his homeworld destroyed, the libraries of knowledge that they had built falling, he really couldn't stand by and do nothing, and he decided he had to join the battle. Magnus finds Leman Russ, and they fight. Magnus was able to puncture one of Leman's hearts by punching him in the chest, but Leman responded by blinding him in his one good eye and then breaking his back over his leg, Bane style. Leman Russ would be a fan of Bane though, I mean honestly. While Magnus is laying there helplessly as his legion and homeworld are destroyed around him, Tzeentch reaches out to him with an offer to save all of it. Magnus accepts, and then immediately, the Primarch, his legion, and his city are all teleported to another planet in the Eye of Terror that had been prepared for him. Bane style. Today we're going to talk about the Isstvan III Atrocity and how it's the beginning of a civil war known as the Horus Heresy. Now that Horus has been corrupted by chaos, as the War Master, he begins to move some of the other legions around in preparation for the civil war that's coming. At this point, Horus is also seeing which forces he can pull to his side, which legions he can turn traitor, and which ones are too loyal to even bother trying. He also gained the support of some of the Imperial engineers in the Mechanicum, which became known as the Dark Mechanicum later on. And so the Dark Mechanicum is basically how the Traitor Legions get all of their war gear and even access to some tech that would have been illegal if they still worked for the Emperor. Horus knows that Lion L. Johnson, Reboot Gilliman, and Sanguinius, as well as their legions, are all way too loyal to even try to turn them, so he tries to get them out of the way. He gave the three of them missions at a distant part of the galaxy, and then made plans to make sure that they would get cut off so they wouldn't be able to play much of a part in the coming conflicts. Then Horus calls the Death Guard, the World Eaters, and the Emperor's children to fight with him at Isstvan III because there's an uprising there. All four of those legions were traitors, but they hadn't revealed that yet because in each of their legions there were still people that were loyal to the Emperor. The four Primarchs determined who in their legion were most likely to stay loyal to the Emperor, and they sent them to the surface of Isstvan III to fight off the rebels. The fighting goes on for a while, and then just as the Space Marines start to get the upper hand, their own forces virus bomb them. If you don't already know, virus bombs are what's known as Exterminatus-class weapons, which means they are planet killers, or at least they kill everything alive on that planet. These weapons are such a big deal that at this point in time, the only people that were actually allowed to use these weapons were the Emperor and the War Master Horus. The virus these bombs release is known as the Life Eater virus. It very quickly spreads to all organic life, plants and animals, and then breaks it down into goo and gas, both of which are flammable. So once the virus has done its thing and everything is pretty much goo, they send a single incendiary strike down on the planet and it sets everything, including the atmosphere, on fire. Some Space Marines that weren't sent down to fight on the ground were actually still loyalist and managed to find out about this plot and warn some of them, so they were able to survive for a little while on the surface. And then Angron got angry and then went down and started wiping them all out. Luckily though, in all the chaos, a single ship, the Eisenstein, managed to break away and get all the way back to the Emperor and warn him that Horus had turned traitor. Let's talk about one of the greatest tragedies of the Horus heresy, the Dropsite Massacre. Following the atrocity of Isstvan III, the Emperor is now aware that the World Eaters, the Emperor's children, the Sons of Horus, and the Death Guard are all traitors. In response, the Emperor sends 7 legions to attack them at Isstvan V. The traitors are dug into their defensive positions, so the Loyalists decide to attack in 2 waves. The first wave being 3 legions making up the Raven Guard, the Iron Hands, and the Salamanders. The second wave consists of the Word Bearers, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, and the Night Lords. The idea is that the first wave wears down the enemy and then pulls back so that the second wave can push forward and wipe them out. And at first, everything was going according to plan. First wave pushes forward, wears down the enemy, and then the second wave arrives and begins to set up reinforcements behind them. Seeing this, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard both pull back to those reinforcements because their legions are pretty battered. But Ferrus Manus saw Fulgrim in the fray, so he and the Iron Hands push forward. For just a little bit of context on this, Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus have always been very close, but when Fulgrim tried to convert Ferrus Manus to a traitor, it went really badly, they came to blows, and now things are really strained between them. So Ferrus saw Fulgrim, he got mad, so he charged when he probably should have pulled back. As the Salamanders and Raven Guard get closer to their backup, dragging their injured behind them, their comms suddenly went quiet. Then one flare from Horus's command post went up and things got really bad. That flare was a signal to these backup legions, the Word Bearers, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, and the Alpha Legion, to begin attacking their own forces because they were unknown to the Loyalists, actually traitors that had been converted by Horus some time ago. As that was already happening, the 4 traitor legions that they were already attacking turned around and then began to fight them as well. So now they're being attacked from 2 sides that are closing in on them. Because the Iron Hands didn't pull back, they were taking a lot of casualties. And eventually, Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus finally meet on the battlefield. One of the reasons that Fulgrim turned to chaos over time was because at some point he found a sword that, unknown to him, contained a demon that would sort of whisper in his ear, and he thought it was his own subconscious. Because his father, the Emperor, told him that demons and voices in his head are silly superstitions that should be ignored because they're not real. The blade had been affecting Fulgrim's mind over time and sort of shaping his changes, but things really came to a head in this fight with Ferrus Manus. Fulgrim pushes Ferrus Manus to the ground and then raises his sword to take him out, and then realizes he's made a terrible mistake, but the sword decides to take the blow for him and decapitates him. Fulgrim is so horrified by this that the blade has an opportunity to take control and he becomes fully demonically possessed. Whereas sometimes possession is a merging of 2 identities, Fulgrim was still his own person, his body was just being controlled by the demon. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard took massive losses. The Raven Guard lost somewhere between 70 to 90% of all of its forces. For reference, that second wave that turned out to be traitors was larger than the original group of first wave loyalists that attacked, and they were pretty worn down and battered by the time they actually were being attacked by that second wave. Vulkan, Corvus Corax, and their legions do manage to escape with some Iron Hands, but because of their losses, they don't really get to play a major part in the rest of the Horus Heresy. Let's go over the Ruinstorm and the Battle of Calth. The Word-Bearers have really disliked the Ultramarines ever since the Emperor ordered them to destroy one of their favorite planets, Monarchia. The Ultramarines were one of the largest legions, though, and the Word-Bearers were relatively small because they had been going really slow along the Great Crusade, setting up their religion. So after they secretly fell to chaos, they really went back to the Great Crusade with force because they wanted their legion to grow, and they wanted to look like they were still loyal to the Emperor. Because the Word-Bearer's gene seed doesn't really have any problems, they were able to grow their legion really large, and by the time Isstvan V came around, they were able to take on the Ultramarines. Before Horus was known to be a traitor, he ordered the Ultramarines to gather at a planet called Calth because they were spread all throughout the galaxy on a bunch of missions. Horus also told them that the Word-Bearers would be joining them after they had some time to gather because there was a large force of orcs nearby, although there wasn't. The world that the Ultramarines are gathering at, Calth, is part of something called the Ultima Segmentum, which is a part of space owned entirely by the Ultramarines, so in a way, they're basically home. Calth happens to also be one of their most prized planets in all of the Ultima Segmentum, so they are completely vulnerable right now because they have no reason to be worried. All their ships are powered down and it would take hours for them to power back up. A large majority of the Word-Bearers Legion joins the Ultramarines at Calth just after Isstvan V, which the Ultramarines of course still don't know about. The fact that Calth is the Ultramarines' prized planet, like how Monarchia was the Word-Bearers' prized planet, is not a coincidence. Their goal was to completely destroy this planet and humiliate the Ultramarines like they had humiliated them. So in preparation for their betrayal, the Word-Bearers had sent some Chaos Cultists down to the planet's surface, and they began performing a ritual. So when the Word-Bearers did eventually turn on the Ultramarines and started wreaking havoc across their planet, the ritual reacted with all the negative emotions and lost lives and churned up the warp into a terrible warp storm known as the Ruinstorm. The Ruinstorm cut off large sections of the galaxy from one another. You couldn't travel through it or communicate through it, unless you happened to be a traitor who was being helped out by the forces of chaos. So the Ultramarines lost about half of their forces at the Battle of Calth, and the Ruinstorm would make sure that they wouldn't really be able to play a big part in the rest of the Horus Heresy, along with the Dark Angels and the Blood Angels. Let's talk about the Shadow Crusade and the apotheosis of Angron. In my previous video, I talked about how the Word-Bearers attacked one of the Ultramarines' prized cities, Calth, and then summoned the Ruinstorm. And while it should be noted that the majority of the Word-Bearers Legion was at Calth, before they attacked, they had split their legion into several parts, and they had gone throughout the Ultima Segmentum. Lorgar also brought the entirety of the World Eaters Legion and Angron with him because he was launching a crusade against the entire Ultima Segmentum that he would call the Shadow Crusade. And they weren't really picking targets with the highest strategic value, rather they were going to places that they could cause as much terror and suffering as they could, both to make the Ruinstorm stronger, but also to humiliate the Ultramarines. Over the course of the Shadow Crusade, Lorgar and Angron attack over 100 Ultramarine worlds before Lorgar starts to notice that Angron has been deteriorating much faster than he thought. Angron's implants, the Butcher's Nails, boost his aggression, but they were slowly killing him. They weren't designed for a Primarch's physiology, so as they bit deeper into his mind, his body would heal and it would get worse. Since the Butcher's Nails are ancient tech that they don't really understand, they decided to go back to Angron's home planet where he got the implants to see if they can find some information on it. While he's there, Angron goes and visits his fallen comrades and remembers the day that ultimately led to him turning traitor against the Emperor. Essentially, Angron started a rebellion with a bunch of other gladiators against the people that were forcing them to fight. Around that time, the Emperor found him, but Angron wouldn't go with him because he was committed to finishing this rebellion with his friends. Then, right before the last battle, where Angron would surely have been outnumbered and defeated, the Emperor just teleported him away, and Angron had to watch all of his friends just die. So he gathers up their bones, puts them on his body, and then decides to go on a rampage with the World Eaters across this entire world. This planet is part of the Ultima Segmentum, and the Ultramarines have been chasing down Lorgar ever since Calth, so eventually they do arrive and a battle starts. Eventually, Lorgar and Reboot find each other on the battlefield, they fight, and Reboot ends up getting the upper hand and almost taking out Lorgar. Lorgar is saved when Angron appears and starts fighting off Reboot, But over the course of that fight, Reboot accidentally knocks the skulls of one of Angron's comrades off of his chest and then steps on it. Angron becomes so unbelievably furious, it's palpable. Like, literally, it affects the warp, and everyone in the area can feel it. Lorgar sees this as his chance to save his brother and decides he's going to save him whether he wants him to or not. So, he starts turning him into a demon prince. Lorgar uses his incredibly powerful psychic abilities to summon the Ruinstorm, and then also begins transforming Angron's body in a terribly, terribly painful process. The few librarians left in the World Eaters Legion see this happening and think that Lorgar is trying to hurt Angron, so they try to stop the process. But it doesn't work, and Angron has never liked his librarians, so he ends up taking all of them out, and this makes Khorne very happy because he doesn't like psychers. So now Angron was a full demon prince of Khorne, and Reboot, who took some pretty serious damage in his fight with Angron, had to leave and sort of mourn what happened to his world and his brothers. Let's talk about Vulkan's imprisonment after the Dropsite Massacre. Vulkan essentially saw his entire legion killed around him, and then suddenly he was surrounded by Night Lords and Iron Warriors. He put up as good of a fight as he could, but he was completely surrounded by Space Marines, so they ended up beating him unconscious, and instead of killing him, Conrad, who is fully insane at this point, decides to take advantage of the situation. In case you don't remember, Captain Edgelord here has just enough of his father's ability to see into the future that he can only see the worst possible future. He does everything he can to try to change this, but drives himself mad because no matter what he does, it never changes. He always kind of resented Vulkan because he may not look it, but he has a very strong sense of justice, like Vulkan does, and he wants what's best for people that deserve it. But their means of achieving these goals are completely opposite. Conrad relies on terror tactics, and Vulkan is generally known to be the kindest and most benevolent of all the Primarchs. So Conrad decides to prove a point by going all the way from Batman to full-out Joker. If he can give Vulkan the worst possible time of his life, then maybe Vulkan will turn out just as bad as Conrad or worse. So he begins tormenting Vulkan in all kinds of ways and ends up accidentally killing him, and then they both discover that he is actually Perpetual like their father. Even Vulkan was unaware of the fact that he was a Perpetual until this happened, but this made Conrad absolutely furious, because this meant no matter what he did to Vulkan, he would just be fine. He did everything he possibly could to torment him physically and mentally. He put him through the worst kinds of pains, and then even put his mind through scenarios where he constantly failed to save people. He tried everything to break his brother and prove that Vulkan was no better than him, but he just couldn't, so he decided maybe a duel will work. At some point, Conrad had asked Perturabo, one of the best engineers in all of the Imperium, to create a labyrinth that would be impossible to navigate. At the center of the labyrinth was Conrad and Vulkan's hammer, but the walls of this labyrinth were completely featureless and the geometry made no sense. Any attempt to mentally map this place would just get you lost. But since the Primarchs, and especially Vulkan, are just built different, of course he just did it anyway. He reached the hammer and he beat the ever-loving crap out of his brother Conrad. Then he reveals to Conrad that his hammer has a teleporter inside, and he just leaves. Teleports into the upper atmosphere of Macragge, the Ultramarines' homeworld, and burns up on re-entry, knowing that he'll be just fine. Let's talk about the Thramas Crusade and the Tuchulcha engine. Following the Dropsite Massacre on Isstvan V, Horus sends the Night Lords and their Primarch Conrad Kurz on something called the Thramas Crusade. During this crusade, the Night Lords terrorized several nearby star systems that were still loyal to the Emperor so that they wouldn't be able to provide him with any reinforcements. One of those systems being the Thramas system. These systems were also relatively close to where Horus had sent the Dark Angels to get them and their Primarch Lionel Johnson out of the way so that they wouldn't be able to play a big part in the Horus heresy. The Night Lords and Dark Angels fought against each other in this crusade for 2 to 3 years before Conrad Kurz decided to parley with Lionel Johnson. Things were relatively civil until Conrad insulted L. Johnson, and then he responded by punching him. Then things quickly escalated from there, and Conrad was strangling his brother. One of the Dark Angels that L. Johnson brought with him to protect him in this meeting ran his sword through Conrad's back, releasing his grip, and then each Primarch was dragged away by their respective legions. Later on, the Dark Angels receive intelligence about Death Guard in the area and that they're attacking a world that's being protected by some Iron Hands, and they decide to help. The Dark Angels helped fight off the Death Guard and then realized that the two forces had been fighting over a very powerful and very ancient device called the Tuchulcha engine. The Tuchulcha engine was a sentient device possibly created by the Old Ones that could make very precise and very efficient warp jumps. The Dark Angels took the Tuchulcha engine and made a warp jump, but along the way they were attacked by demons, and L. Johnson actually had to reinstate the Librarians because it's very difficult to fight demons with anything but psychic powers. At the battle's climax, Lionel Johnson was actually confronted with one of Tzeentch's most powerful demons, Kairos Fateweaver, who tried to corrupt him to the side of chaos, but literally had nothing. He just couldn't. El'Jonson responds by stabbing it in the heart, and the Dark Angels eventually exit the warp. Now that the Dark Angels have the Tuchulcha engine, they decide to plan an elaborate ambush against the Night Lords. This ambush was devastating to the Night Lords, who lost about a fourth of their legion, and the rest of them scattered. Desperate and running out of other options, Conrad and his elite Terminators decide to board the Dark Angels' flagship. And it went very badly for them. Almost all of them were wiped out, but Conrad managed to escape and hide in the bowels of their ship for a very long time. They send Dark Angel squad after him, and he just keeps taking them out, and eventually, the hunter himself, Lion El'Jonson, has to go hunt Conrad. Despite the fact that he is a master hunter, Conrad manages to evade him and eventually, somehow, escapes the ship into the void. Today we're going to talk about the Signus Campaign. Before the Horus heresy, Sanguinius and Horus were actually really close, and they fought several campaigns together. And in one of those campaigns, Horus learned about one of the flaws of the Blood Angels, the Red Thirst. The Blood Angels have a lot of really strong vampire themes in their legions, so the Red Thirst is this constant craving for destruction, violence, and their enemy's blood that they always have to fight. When a Blood Angel succumbs to the Red Thirst, they can usually be brought out of it and calmed down by someone like a chaplain, but sometimes that's not possible. And in those cases, it's usually the job of someone like Sanguinius or some other high-ranking officer to take care of that Space Marine themselves. The Blood Angels were pretty ashamed of this flaw in their genome that would essentially break down all of their discipline and just turn them into angry animals, so they kept it a secret from pretty much everyone. Sanguinius was especially ashamed because he felt responsible for this. He knew that this rage came from him, and he wanted to find a cure for the Red Thirst. So sometime during the Great Crusade, the Luna Wolves and Blood Angels are fighting with each other, and Horus notices that Sanguinius took out one of his own Space Marines. Horus was completely shocked and confused by this, so Sanguinius explained the Red Thirst to him and asked him to keep it a secret, and Horus said that he would. Now, way later, just before Isstvan III, when Horus is about to announce that he's a traitor, he tells Sanguinius he's found a cure for the Red Thirst. It's in the Signus Cluster. The Signus Cluster is all the way in the Ultima Segmentum, which means the Blood Angels will be far away from Terra when Horus attacks it. And it also means they'll be cut off from Terra by the Ruinstorm that the Word Bearers summon. Things started to go pretty bad for the Blood Angels almost as soon as they arrived, though, especially once they got to Signus Prime. First, they were hit with a wave of psychic energy that drove some of the Space Marines mad. The affected Blood Angels would take out their allies or themselves, and that included the Admiral of their flagship, the Red Tier. The Admiral thought that the entire bridge crew had been affected and took them all out, and then realized that they were the person that was actually affected, so they decided to crash the ship onto the surface of Signus Prime and then end themselves. Classy. The ship is kind of intact, but mostly destroyed, so the Blood Angels try to turn what's left into a kind of fortress as they fight off these waves and waves of demons. One of these demons is particularly infamous, this one, the bloodthirster Kabanda. Sanguinius goes and fights him in one-on-one combat, and during that fight, the demon reveals to Sanguinius that his brother actually betrayed him by sending him here. This information really throws off Sanguinius, and the demon takes advantage of this by using his whip to crush Sanguinius' legs, and now he's helpless. Kabanda takes this opportunity to very quickly kill over 500 Blood Angels, which creates a ton of psychic energy that fuels something called the Rage Fire. There was actually so much psychic energy that it knocked Sanguinius unconscious. The Rage Fire is more or less a psychic entity that was made from the Red Thirst and intensifies the Red Thirst of everything around it. So almost every single Blood Angel there starts succumbing to the Red Thirst, and they just start going on a rampage. Luckily, some of the Legion's former librarians manage to resist the Red Thirst and heal Sanguinius. Sanguinius and Kabanda fight again, but this time Sanguinius wins and banishes the demon back to the warp. Horus had hoped that the influence of the Red Thirst and the Rage Fire would be able to turn the Blood Angels and their Primarch Traitor, but unfortunately, it actually just made them very, very angry at Horus.